When we started our woodworking business around a month ago, we probably put hundreds of hours of research into it. After all, when you're going to essentially quit your construction day jobs and take a risk creating content, you'd hope there's at least some planning put into it. Andrew and I had spent days trying to figure out what our first big project would be, and then it hit us. When making content on YouTube, you can't exactly just upload any old table or project and expect to gain any traction. You're competing with guys like Blacktail Studio, Four Eyes Furniture, and many more greats of YouTube carpentry. Guys who have huge shops, every tool in the book, and years of experience. So for two guys just starting out, we decided that creating something cool for free for somebody else on YouTube would be the ideal way to gain some traction. That's how we settled on this chessboard for Hikaru Nakamura. Anyways, now to the build. We wanted it to be a statement piece, something unique, so with that in mind, we decided to create it out of Purple Heart and Maple, courtesy of Century Mill here in the GTA. As soon as we got back from the mill, we started cutting down the rough wood into nicer boards. After measuring, we sized the boards down to a workable length with the skill saw, and then set up the planer to get the wood down to the correct thickness. And then we planed. And planed. And you guessed it, planed some more. And then finally, after almost an hour of planing, we eventually got the wood down to the correct thickness we needed for our chessboard. Next, Andrew brought out the track saw, and after carefully lining everything up and clamping, he cut a straight edge along one side of the board. While making this chessboard, we found that there is a ton of repetition. Everything you do to the Purple Heart, you'll also most likely have to do to the Maple, so the first day or so of the build was extremely repetitive. After we cut the straight edge, we then got out the joiner and began jointing all of the boards we just cut, making sure that we have some nice edges to run through the table saw and glue together later. Next, we ran each board through the table saw a few times to cut the strips that will be used for the squares on our board. When building a chessboard for people who actually play chess for a living, we figured that there's a few rules you need to follow to ensure a good playing experience. Number 1, ensure that the squares are within the tournament standard guidelines, and number 2, ensure that the board is actually comfortable to play on. Nobody wants to be reaching upwards to place their piece, especially people who play bullet chess where every move needs to be as quick as possible. We'll deal with the height later, but these rules led us to decide on 2¼ inch dimensions for each piece, right in between the 2 to 2.4 inches mandated by the International Chess Federation. Now that we have all of our strips cut, the next step is to begin the first of many glue-ups. We always spread out brown paper on our work surface before we glue, just to make sure none of those extra drips end up on the actual table. The general idea here is to glue all of these pieces together and then cut horizontal strips once it's dry. So we squeezed on our glue, spread it around, and pushed the pieces together, putting some wooden blocks on top to ensure that the pieces are evenly squished together. Then we clamped everything together and left it to sit for a day. The next day came and we rushed right back to the shop to see the results of our glue up. Everything went to plan, so Andrew unclamped the piece and we got out the planer again to cut everything down and make sure our seams are perfect. We cut the piece in half. Now it's time to cut it into strips, so Andrew measured everything out perfectly, leaving about an eighth here and there to allow for joining once the pieces are cut. And then it was off to the table saw once again. Here's where I think the chessboard really starts to come together. Before it wasn't quite clear what we were making, but now the familiar grid squares chess players know and love are starting to come together. On one of the little Purple Heart squares, there ended up being a pretty huge knot that we didn't notice, so the piece split right down the middle. Luckily, with a little CA glue and some clamps, it ended up coming back together quite nicely, and we kept on going. If I've learned anything in life, it's that if something is going good, a lot of the time there will be something along the way that just has to ruin it. Which is exactly what happens when our breaker blew and our power went out.
Oh, that's it.
Apparently, the system couldn't handle running our joiner and a space heater at the exact same time, and unfortunately, we suffered the consequences. We run our shop out of a larger facility with a bunch of other craftsmen, and that means that we had to go to the building staff to get the lights back on. Which is also exactly why we'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe so that we can get our own shop one day. The staff promptly told us that they had no idea where our breaker room was and that we'd have to wait until the maintenance guy could show up. We had a sneaking suspicion that the breaker room was the giant door that said staff only right next to our unit, but they wouldn't let us in, so we were barred from doing any work for about half a week. But regardless, Monday came around and we finally got the call that everything was fixed. And by the way, the breaker was in fact inside the giant door that we thought it was behind, but we were back in business, so we got right back to work. Each of the individual strips had to have square edges before we could glue them, so we got to work running everything through the joiner yet again and lining it up on the table for gluing. I was not kidding earlier when I said that there would be many glue ups with this project, and we're not even half done at this point. This is where our glue ups need to be more precise than ever before. If we are off by even a 1/16 of an inch, there will be noticeable gaps in the board and we will have to start over. So with that in mind, we spread out our paper again and carefully began clamping the strips together. Andrew drilled a hole in the table so that we could fit a clamp on the other side of our piece, but we could not for the life of us find where the hole was after we put the paper on.
God. I was like feeling that every time.
After about a minute we found it, but not before getting a sore finger. We did this in 2 halves because there was no way we'd be able to fit the complete board in the planer, so we thought it would be best to have one additional glue up to help save hours of potential sanding. After the board was all clamped up, we went home for the day to give it time to dry. The next morning, we didn't exactly have a ton of stuff to do. We unclamped our piece around midday, giving it around 24 hours to dry, and then ran it through the planer and joiner once again. Now that the pieces were perfectly flat, we could begin the final glue up for the board. It was beginning to finally look like an actual chessboard. We glued it up, clamped the 2 pieces together, waited another day once again, and then came right back to see our results. And it was nearly perfect. When you think about it, this honestly could be a finished chessboard in itself. It has all the parts you need to play the game, aside from the pieces of course, but we wanted to create a nice elevated trim, so we decided to use the extra purple heart we had for the border. Andrew selected a piece, then cut it into 4 even strips that would each serve as one side of the trim. We didn't exactly want to just tack on 4 rectangular pieces to serve as the boundary, so Andrew got to work creating that hidden reveal floating look I spoke about earlier. We needed a router for this, so after ordering a router table insert on Amazon, we got to work installing it so the pieces could get trimmed down. We used the router to cut out a hole in the work table with a recessed portion that the actual table insert would sit on. Andrew then put the table in with some shims to make sure that it is even, and we were in business. We used quite a few router bits in this build, with the first being a square bit to cut a tiny ridge into the border so that the chessboard has something to actually sit on. This part is going to provide depth to the build to make it really look like the board is floating. One thing we've learned in the small time that we've been woodworking is that it's really worth it to spend a bit of money on good, quality router bits. We bought an inexpensive dovetail bit on Amazon to make a YouTube short, and it ended up just being a cheap Chinese bit that just burned our wood and made it look horrible. Luckily, Andrew also bought a set of Bosch bits, and these have been serving us well with really nice cuts, as you can see here. I think we found that in woodworking, you really get what you pay for when it comes to expensive tools. After all of the ridges were routered in, then Andrew started to cut the miters so that each corner of the chessboard comes to a nice point. Before we fastened the trim to the board, we needed to clean it up a little because there was a lot of residual tape and glue from the glue up, so Andrew got out the sander and went to town with a low grit to take off all that nasty stuff. We also needed to cut out a bevel on the actual board so that there is both a ledge for the trim to sit on and a 45-degree angle that makes the board pop out of the frame. It was back to the router table once again, this time with the big glued up board. The chessboard edge was a 2-step process. We first cut that square edge for the trim on each side, and then we got out the track saw, set it to about 45 degrees, and then cut that nice angled bevel on the edge. After a pass on each side, the board was looking amazing, so it was time to finally attach our trim pieces. It took quite a while to get the miters exactly perfect, but eventually Andrew got it, and we began securing them to the chessboard with some clamps and a lot of CA glue. Now, initially for the finish, the plan was to just slap on some Osmo satin and call it a day, but around halfway through the build, Andrew had an idea. We hadn't really worked with epoxy before this build, and Andrew thought that it would be the perfect opportunity to dip our toes into the craft and create a beautiful glassy finish on the surface of the board at the same time. It was settled, so we headed off to the woodworking store, grabbed some epoxy, and came back to try it out. Now, we were nervous. We had to get this right or the entire board would be ruined. Our mold was an entire process. We've heard the horror stories of epoxy blowouts, and the board was going to cure in our makeshift office with a heater, so the last thing we wanted was to come back to epoxy all over the floor. So with that in mind, we spent a long time making sure that this mold was completely airtight. Tuck tape here, painter's tape here, clamps, screws, the whole deal. We finally got to a point where we felt we were comfortable that it wouldn't blow out, and we began mixing the epoxy. We then poured it directly on top of the piece, then moved it inside the office where it was warm enough for it to cure for a day or so. We made sure that the benches we put it on were level, then used the heater to help dissipate some of the stubborn bubbles that were sticking around. The pour was only about 1/8 thick, so we came back a day or so later and it was hardened up and ready for finishing. Given that the bottom of the board is somewhat hollow, we wanted to stiffen it up a little bit to make sure that it wouldn't break. So we bought a thin piece of plywood, cut it to size, then glued it inside the hollow portion. Next came hours and hours of sanding. I joke around with Andrew that if I record any more sanding footage, I will quite literally have no more space on my hard drive because it takes so long. I didn't really believe all these YouTubers when they say that sanding is more than half of the project, and they were not lying. But anyways, we used 3 different ascending grits as standard, and once Andrew was content with the finish, we cleaned it off and grabbed that Osmo satin finish I was talking about earlier. We thought it was kind of funny how dangerous this stuff is according to the label, where it says materials such as rags used with this product may begin to burn by themselves. I think it's safe to say that we'll be using gloves for this stuff. Andrew rubbed it all over the top and then the sides, making sure to get it all inside that hidden reveal we talked about earlier. We decided on a few coats, so after a cycle of applying, letting it dry, applying again, and then letting it dry once again, we were finally done. We thought it turned out fantastic and would be a statement piece in anybody's living room. It took a while, and we definitely had more than a few setbacks, but we now finally had a finished piece that was ready to give to Hikaru Nakamura.
And speaking of which, my name is Christian, and I am one half of Cognac Furniture. I'm the guy behind the camera in most of the shots you've seen, and the one who makes the videos. When we got into this project, we didn't exactly know how we'd actually get into contact with Hikaru. It was kind of like a do now and ask questions later sort of scenario, if you know what I mean. So with that being said, if there is anybody watching this who is connected to him somehow, or Hikaru, if you are somehow watching this yourself, please reach out to us on Instagram because we would absolutely love to get you your chessboard. Anyways, you will for sure be seeing more of us soon. Thank you to everybody who stuck around this long. I appreciate you all. Please subscribe if you did enjoy, and we will see you guys on the next project.